That's how many people walked past him in the first 11 minutes without a single glance. He counted. He always counted. Not because it hurt anymore, or at least that's what he told himself, standing there on the 3rd of June, pressed into the iron railing on the mall like a splinter that nobody wanted to dig out. The plane trees above him were doing that thing they do in early summer, shedding their pale skin in long, curling strips, and one of those strips landed on his shoulder at exactly 9:04 in the morning and stayed there the whole time. Nobody told him. Nobody looked long enough to notice. His name was Desmond Achike, 41 years old, library cataloger, Season 3 rewatcher of a cooking show he never actually cooked from, owner of a burgundy anorak that his mother bought him in 1997 and that he kept wearing not because he had to, but because, well, some things you just keep wearing. He had come to the parade alone. This wasn't unusual. Desmond did most things alone, ate alone, walked alone, sat in the back row of the cinema alone with his popcorn arranged in a very specific architectural formation he'd been refining since 1999. Aloneness, for Desmond, had long since stopped being a wound and become something closer to furniture. A familiar weight in the room that he'd stopped noticing was heavy. But the counting, that was new. It had started 6 weeks ago at the bus stop on Vauxhall Bridge Road. He'd been standing there for 14 minutes, umbrella up, and it was one of those London drizzle situations that makes everyone miserable enough to stare at the middle distance. A woman had walked straight into him, not glanced off, walked directly through the space he occupied like he was a suggestion. She'd looked up, blinked at the bus stop sign, and kept moving. No epalegi, no recognition. Not even the small, irritated noise people make when they almost walk into a lamppost. He'd stood there thinking, does she not see me? Or does she see me and make an instant decision that I don't require acknowledgement? He hadn't been able to answer it. So he started counting. The mall on Trooping the Color Morning is a specific kind of beautiful that Desmond had always privately loved, the way some people love things they're too self-conscious to admit in company. The avenue stretches from Buckingham Palace all the way back toward Trafalgar like a river that's been iron flat, and by 8:30 the trees on both sides are thick with people who've been there since 6, staking out their viewing squares with the focused aggression of territorial birds. He'd arrived at 7:15. He had a good spot, right on the front rail, 20 meters back from the corner where the mounted division would turn, which meant he'd get the full broadside of the horses and the band of the household cavalry before they wheeled toward the palace. He knew this because he'd been coming to this exact spot for 9 years. Same railing, same corner, same burgundy anorak. The family who'd claimed the 3 feet of railing to his left arrived at 7:52. Father, mother, 2 kids, grandmother with a flag she'd clearly bought on the walkover because the little wooden stick was still wrapped in the shop's rubber band. The children pushed immediately to the front, the way children do, redistributing everyone with their elbows. Desmond shifted, smiled at the grandmother. She looked at her flag. The group of Italian tourists to his right arrived at 8:10, and they were the specific brand of Italian tourist who communicate primarily through sound effects, long, appreciative notes at anything, and Desmond had immediately liked them. They'd taken 17 photographs of the plane tree above him within the first 4 minutes. They did not photograph him or include him in anything, but they were loud and warm, and the sound of them was like leaving a window open. By 9:17, the crowd behind him had closed into something dense and communal, everyone's elbows learning the geography of everyone else's backs, and Desmond was at the front of it, touching the railing, technically part of this mass of people without being known by a single one of them. 47. That was the new count. He marked it the way he always did. Not in a notebook. He wasn't that kind of counter, just a number that sat in the front of his mind the way a phone number sits there when you're walking to the phone, and try not to lose it before you dial. 47 people whose gaze had moved across the geography of this crowd and rearranged itself around him without stopping. It wasn't self-pity. He was almost certain it wasn't self-pity. It was more like data collection, like he was trying to figure out something structural. Whether invisibility was a quality he possessed or a habit the world had gotten into. The sound hit before the sight did. That's the thing about the household cavalry that people who've only seen it on television don't understand. The sound arrives first, and it arrives as a physical thing. Hooves on tarmac at parade pace make a sound that goes through your sternum rather than your ears. It's less percussion and more pressure, a rhythm you feel in the fillings of your back teeth. The crowd heard it and did what crowds do, became one animal. Desmond heard it and felt his chest do something complicated and warm. He'd loved this his whole life. Since the first time his mother had dragged him here at age 7, his hand inside hers, and he'd stood at this exact railing and felt the vibration move through the soles of his shoes and turned to look at her face, and she'd already been crying. Not sobbing, just the specific kind of crying that adults do when something is too large for the container of their face. She died in February. Not recently. 2018. The burgundy anorak was hers. He didn't think about that right now. He just counted. 49. The family to his left reorganized as the sound grew. The kids pressed harder against the railing, and the father put his hand on Desmond's shoulder. Not deliberately, just using him as a brace while he lifted his phone for video, and then removed the hand without registering it had been a human shoulder rather than the railing itself. Desmond didn't move. He kept his eyes on the turn in the road. They came around the corner at 9:24. First, the outriders, their horses massive and composed in the way that large, confident things are composed, like the panic and noise of the crowd was simply not pitched at a frequency they received. Then the mounted band, silver kettle drums swaying, the drummer's arms moving in that particular economy of motion that looks effortless and isn't. Then, the color party. The crowd made a noise. Not words, just that collective sound, the one that comes out of 300 gathered strangers when they see something that the English side of them wants to call impressive, and the human side of them just calls beautiful. A long, pulled breath that becomes a low sound. A sound like the beginning of something. Desmond made the same sound. He didn't notice he did. His hands were on the railing, and the vibration was traveling up his arms, and he was making the sound, and his eyes were moving slowly down the line of horses and soldiers and flags and glinting brass, and for the first minute and 40 seconds that they were in front of him, the number in his head went quiet. Just quiet. No count. Just the sound and the vibration and the morning light coming sideways through the plain trees and hitting the breastplates of the household cavalry at an angle that turned them briefly, gorgeously, into pieces of sun. The grandmother to his left said something in a language he didn't know, low and reverent. One of the Italian tourists said "Mamma Mia" completely sincerely, without irony, the way people only say in actual moments of visual overload. The little girl in front of him grabbed the railing with both hands and held on like the parade was a current she was trying not to be swept into. Desmond watched her grip tighten. He watched the knuckles go white. He thought, I know that feeling exactly. The column took 4 minutes and 19 seconds to pass. He'd timed it before. He timed it every year. When the last of the rear guard moved beyond the curve and the sound began to soften, that gradual recession that feels like the tide going out, the crowd exhaled as one and then immediately began to dissolve back into individual people again, separate and busy fishing for phones, turning to partners, commenting and explaining and performing having witnessed something. The Italian tourists were debating something with the physical energy of a legal proceeding. The family to his left began immediately negotiating breakfast. The children wanted somewhere with pancakes specifically. The grandmother was already holding her little flag in both hands like a thing she'd carried home from a place she was leaving. Desmond stood at the railing. He didn't turn yet. He was looking at the empty road, at the tarmac where the horses had been, at the small evidence they'd left. He wouldn't name it more specifically than that, at the way the plain tree shadows fell differently now that the crowd had thinned a little. 53. That's where the count had landed. He'd picked it back up sometime in the last minute of the parade, almost without deciding to. 53 people over the course of the morning who had looked at, through, or near him without the count stopping for him. He didn't know what the number meant. He didn't know if it was high or low. He had no baseline. Maybe everyone standing at this railing, alone or with others, was equally invisible to their neighbors. Maybe visibility was just a story people told themselves, that they were seen, registered, known by the strangers around them. and the truth was that all of them were only ever slightly more substantial than the air between them. Maybe, or maybe Desmond Achike, in his mother's burgundy anorak, had gotten very good at occupying space without requiring anything of it. The grandmother touched his arm, just for a second, just patted it the way old women sometimes do to strangers, an impulse older than language. She said something. He didn't speak the language, but the shape of her voice was clear enough. Wasn't that something? He turned to look at her. She was already turning away, following her family toward the pancake negotiation, the little flag still upright in her hands. Desmond stood at the railing. 53 people. One grandmother. He put his hands in the pockets of the burgundy anorak and started to walk back through the park, and the morning opened around him, and the plain trees shed their pale skin in long, curling strips, and he counted nothing at all for a while. Just walked, just breathed, just let the vibration in his sternum go on echoing past the time it had any right to. There's a bench in St. James's Park that Desmond Achike had been eating lunch on periodically for 11 years. Not every day, not even every week, but when the occasion called for it, when the library got too fluorescent, or the cataloging too repetitive, or the four walls of his one-bedroom flat in Pimlico too familiar in a way that started to feel less like home and more like evidence, he walked the 12 minutes to this bench, sat down with whatever he'd bought from the Pret by the tube station, and ate facing the water. The bench had no plaque, no dedication. Nobody had died for it. It was just a bench that happened to face the right direction at the right angle, so that the light came over the water in the late morning and made the whole surface look like it was breathing. He sat on it now, post-parade, anorak on, a coffee from the cart by the footbridge going cold in his hand, watching a pelican arrange itself on a bollard with the self-possession of something that had never in its life doubted its right to be exactly where it was. He liked pelicans. They were absurd, and they knew it, and they didn't care. The park was still full of parade aftermath, people in festive colors, small children in a state of granular sugar collapse, Union flags being folded inexpertly into bags. The sound of the morning was dissolving into the ordinary sound of Saturday in a city where something large had just happened, and life was resuming around the edges of it. Desmond drank his cold coffee. He thought about the count. 53. He'd been doing the count for 6 weeks. 6 different occasions, different locations, the bus stop, the supermarket on Warwick Way, the reading room at Tate Britain, where he'd sat for 2 hours looking at a Turner he'd seen 20 times, and the attendant hadn't once looked at him. A Sunday walk along the embankment, the pub quiz of the Crown where he'd sat in the corner and answered 7 rounds correctly in his head without entering. And now the parade. The numbers varied. The bus stop had been the highest, 61 in 40 minutes, though that was a busy commuter period and possibly an unfair sample. The Tate had been the lowest. The attendant had technically glanced at him twice, though Desmond wasn't sure proximity-forced eye contact should count, philosophically. He hadn't told anyone about the counting, not because he was embarrassed by it, more because, who would he tell? His colleague Priya at the library, who was lovely, but whose interest in him extended to borrowing his stapler and forgetting to return it? His upstairs neighbor Marcus, with whom he had developed over 7 years a relationship of such careful mutual non-imposition that saying, "I've been counting how many people don't see me," would have violated every established protocol between them. There wasn't anyone to tell. He was fine with this. He was largely fine with this. The pelican arranged its left wing. "You counting them too?" He turned. She was maybe 30, 32, sitting at the other end of his bench. Had she been there? He hadn't heard her sit down. She had on a jacket that was the color of old brick, and she was holding a red thermos that she was unscrewing with the practiced efficiency of someone who drank things from thermoses in parks regularly. Her hair was pulled back in the way that looks like you just pulled it back and looks better for it. She was looking at the pelicans. There were 3 of them now. He'd missed the other 2 arriving. The pelicans, he said. The people. She nodded toward the parade aftermath. The families, the flag folders, the children in collapse. They all walked past that one. She pointed to the original bollard pelican, and none of them looked up. Not one. "I've been watching." Desmond looked at her. "I counted," she said. 19 people in 5 minutes. She unscrewed the thermos lid the rest of the way. Big Bird, standing right there. Not one person. He turned back to the pelican. The pelican was enormous when you actually looked at it. Prehistoric scale. The kind of creature that should require acknowledgement. 22, Desmond said. She looked at him. In the first 11 minutes of the morning, he said. At the parade railing. They were looking at me. A beat. Out of how many total? She said. 53. Roughly. I started losing the thread during the cavalry. She considered this the way people consider things they're genuinely interested in. Not performing interest, not manufacturing a social response, but actually sitting with it for a second before speaking. Is it 53 people who didn't look, or 53 people who looked, but she made a gesture with the thermos lid that meant, and then immediately filed you away as unimportant. The second one, he said, the not looking I can't count. There are too many variables. Right? It's the looking through that's the data. Yes. She poured something from the thermos that smelled like good tea. Not the tea bag kind. The kind someone made at home in a pot, and then transferred, which meant she planned this. Planned the bench, planned the park, planned the sitting here after whatever she'd come from. Were you at the parade? He asked. No, I was at a thing. She didn't elaborate. He didn't push. You go every year? 9 years. Same spot. Alone. He looked at her. Sorry, she said. That came out like I was making a point. I'm not. I know, he said. Yes. Alone. She nodded. She looked at the pelican. The pelican looked at the middle distance, which is where pelicans keep their thoughts. I did the same thing once, she said. Different thing. I was counting how many people on my street knew my name. Over the course of a month. I'd lived there 6 years. How many? 3. She drank her tea. 1 was the postman. 1 was the woman who leaves passive-aggressive notes about recycling sorting. And 1 was a man called Gerald who would have known anyone's name. I think he just collected names. It wasn't specific to me. So, essentially 1, Desmond said. Essentially 1. She smiled at this. Not a wide smile. The kind that sits at one corner of the mouth and admits something. The postman. They sat with this for a moment. The third pelican rearranged itself, knocking the first one slightly sideways, and the first one turned its enormous head and looked at the third one with what could only be described as dignity deployed against injustice. I'm Saoirse, she said. She said it Saoirse, automatically, in a way people who've had their name mispronounced their entire lives say it before you have the chance to say it wrong. Desmond, he said. What do you do with the numbers, Desmond? He thought about it honestly. I don't know yet, he said. I think I'm still collecting them. For what? I don't know that either. He looked at his coffee, which had gone from cold to room temperature, which was arguably worse. Maybe it's just, I want to know whether it was real, whether it was a thing that was happening, or whether I was imagining it. And it's real, he said. She didn't say I'm sure that's not true, or people are just busy, or any of the things people say when they want to smooth over an uncomfortable acknowledgement. She just nodded once with the gravity of someone receiving an accurate report. Yeah, she said. It's real. The park shifted around them. A child somewhere behind them began crying in the dedicated professional way that meant hunger or fatigue or both. A pair of pigeons conducted a brief, vigorous argument over a dropped chip. The pelicans stood on their bollards and held the afternoon lightly between them. Did it change anything? Saoirse asked. The counting. Once you confirmed it was real, did that help? Desmond turned his cold coffee cup in his hands. It's strange, he said slowly. It's like when something is invisible, it has a certain weight to it. It presses on you from the inside because you can't name it. But once you've named it, it doesn't necessarily get lighter. It just stops pressing from the inside and starts sitting in the room with you. She looked at him. Where you can at least see it, she said. Where you can at least see it, he agreed. The parade had fully dissolved by now. The mall beyond the trees was emptying. The official London of crimson and brass and hoofbeats was folding itself back into the storage of itself until next time, and the ordinary London was reasserting itself around the edges, the buses and the pigeons and the people with nowhere particular to be. Saoirse poured the last of her tea. I think, she said carefully, that some people walk through the world leaving marks everywhere they go. and some people walk through it leaving almost no trace. And neither of those people is wrong, exactly. It's just the ones who leave no trace have to know that about themselves, or it drives them sideways. He looked at her. I'm just speculating, she said. I don't know you. No, he said. But you're not wrong. She put the thermos lid back on. She looked at the pelicans one more time, with the expression of someone paying proper respects to something they won't see again soon. I hope the number is lower next time, she said. The parade number? Whichever number you're counting. She stood, tucked the thermos under her arm, and walked back toward the footbridge. He watched her go. She didn't look back. Not because she'd forgotten he was there. He was nearly certain of that. It was the other kind of not looking back. The kind that means, this conversation is complete, and I'm leaving it whole. Desmond sat on the bench. The pelican on the bollard turned its massive head and, for approximately 2 seconds, looked directly at him. Not through him. Not past him. At him. Desmond looked back. The pelican looked away first, which was, Desmond thought, adjusting the count in his head. Not the people count, a different number entirely, something he hadn't been tracking, and maybe should, a start. He didn't go straight home. This was unlike him. Desmond's post-parade routine had been fixed for 9 years. Parade, coffee cart, the 12-minute walk back through the park, flat, kettle, whatever documentary he'd cued during the week, and he'd never deviated from it. Not even a year it rained so hard the mall turned briefly into a river, and everyone scattered like startled birds. But he didn't go home. He walked instead, not toward anything, not toward the flat in Pimlico, not toward the library, not toward the Tate or the embankment or any of the fixed points of his fixed geography. He just walked through the park and out the other side on a birdcage walk, past the row of white stucco buildings that looked in the morning light like a film set of themselves, past the guards on the corner who stood so still they'd become part of the architecture, past the tourists who were still arranging themselves in front of everything, still doing the thing tourists do, which is to put themselves inside a frame and call a memory. He walked past all of it. He'd been walking for 20 minutes when he realized he'd stopped counting. Not the parade count. That was settled. 53. It was sitting in a room with him now. He'd named it, and it had weight, but wasn't pressing anymore. He'd stopped the ambient count he'd maintained for 6 weeks, without fully realizing he was maintaining it. The background tally of gazes that moved through him rather than stopping at him. He'd been walking for 20 minutes, and the number in the front of his mind was quiet. He didn't know if it was because of the pelican. He didn't know if it was because of Saoirse. He thought probably it was neither exactly, that it was the particular combination of the morning, the cavalry sound in his sternum, the grandmother's hand on his arm, the pelican's direct and uncomplicated acknowledgement, and the conversation on the bench, all of it arriving in sequence like a sentence that takes the whole paragraph to complete and only means what it means at the very end. He stopped at a church. He didn't know why. He wasn't religious, not in a committed way, not in a lapsed way, not in any organized sense. But the door was open, and the inside of it was cool, and the light coming through the windows was doing something to the dust in the air that made the dust look like it was participating in something. He went in. It was empty except for a woman in the far left pew who was praying, really praying, not the performative kind, but the kind that means the person has forgotten where they are and isn't available, and a verger arranging something at the back with the specific quiet efficiency of someone who does the same thing every Saturday. Desmond sat in a pew near the middle. Not the front, not the back, the middle. He sat, and the cool of the stone and the wood settled around him, and the dust moved in the light from the windows, and he thought about his mother. He hadn't thought about her this morning at the railing. He'd felt the anorak on his shoulders, the familiar weight of it, the way the pockets sat at exactly the right height for his hands, the way the fabric smelled faintly of somewhere he couldn't name. And he'd told himself he wasn't thinking about her. He'd told himself it was just a coat. He thought about the first time she'd brought him here. Not here specifically, to the parade, to the railing, his hand inside hers, and the vibration through the soles of his shoes, and then the cavalry coming around the corner and making a sound that was too big for him to hold. And he'd started crying, not because he was scared, but because the beauty of it was simply more than his 7-year-old chest could contain. And his mother, who was already crying in her own controlled, dignified way, had squeezed his hand and said, "Some things are just too big for us, baby. You just have to let them go through you." He'd been letting things go through him ever since. The vibration of the cavalry, the strips of bark from the plane trees, the gazes of 53 people, the weight of the burgundy anorak, the sound she made when she laughed at something genuinely funny. Not her polite laugh, her real one, which came from somewhere lower and was slightly embarrassing to her, and which he would give a number he wasn't ready to name yet to hear one more time. The woman in the far left pew finished praying. She didn't get up right away. She just sat there with whatever she'd put down and whatever she'd picked up in the praying, sitting in the particular silence of someone who has just finished a conversation. Desmond understood this completely. He was in the church for 17 minutes. He didn't pray. He didn't think exactly. He sat with things, which is different from thinking about them. He sat with the count, 53, and turned it over and looked at its underside, at what it was actually made of. Here is what he found, sitting in the middle pew of the empty church with the dust and the light. The counting had never been about being seen. Or it had started that way. The bus stop, the woman who walked through him, the question, is this real or is it me? That was the beginning, and it was about visibility. He needed to confirm the thing he suspected, that there was something about him that registered in the world at the frequency of wallpaper. But somewhere in the 6 weeks of counting, it had become something else. It had become attention. He'd been paying close, specific, sustained attention to the people who didn't see him. And in doing so, he had seen them, fully, carefully, with the particular quality of observation that only comes from having nothing else to do with your eyes. He'd seen the woman at the bus stop whose shoes were the wrong size by half a size, who was walking with the compensatory gait of someone enduring something small and chronic. He'd seen the boy at the reading room of the Tate who stared at a painting for 2 minutes without moving and was unmistakably weeping in the private way teenagers do when they discover that art can do that to you. He'd seen the Italian tourists this morning photographing the plane tree with the specific urgency of people trying to take home something that can't be taken home. He'd seen the grandmother with the flag. He'd seen the little girl's white knuckles on the railing. He'd seen Saoirse sitting at the end of his bench before he realized she was there, turning her red thermos in her hands like a thought she was working through. He'd been invisible for 6 weeks. He'd seen everything. It was the verger who broke it. He'd come down the aisle. The verger, a small man in his 60s with the careful walk of someone who'd learned every loose flagstone in this floor over years, and he stopped at Desmond's pew. Not intrusively, just stopped. "You all right, son?" he said. Not son condescendingly. Son the way older men from certain generations say it, meaning, "I see you, and I'm checking." Desmond looked up. "Yes," he said. "Thank you. Just sitting." The verger nodded, looked at the anorak, looked at Desmond's face with the particular quality of attention that comes from a lifetime of moving quietly around the edges of people at their most unguarded. "Parade morning," the verger said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. My wife used to come every year. Same spot, down by the turn." Said the cavalry going past was the closest thing she'd felt to, he considered the word, to being held up by something. He didn't elaborate on the used to. He didn't need to. Desmond said nothing, because the right thing to say was nothing. "You can stay as long as you need," the verger said, and walked back to his arranging. Desmond left at 12:40. He walked south, then east, then through the back streets of Pimlico with their white houses and their tiny front gardens and their Thursday-specific quietness that Saturday never quite achieved. He passed a newsagent where an elderly man was reading the sports pages in the doorway. He passed a cafe where a young couple were doing the specific thing of not saying something important while saying other things. He passed a child sitting on a front step talking to a beetle with the absolute seriousness of a deposition. He did not count. He watched. He let things come through him without keeping score of them. At 1:07, he opened the door to his flat. He took off the burgundy anorak and hung it, not on the hook by the door where his regular coats lived, but on the back of the kitchen chair where he sat in the mornings, where he'd see it, where it was near the light. He filled the kettle. He thought about the grandmother's hand on his arm, the brevity of it, the warmth of it. He thought about the verger's face, the economy of kindness in it. He thought about the pelican's 2 seconds of direct, uncomplicated regard. He thought about Saoirse saying it's real the way someone confirms a diagnosis they're not afraid of. He made his tea. He sat at the kitchen table, in his chair, under the burgundy anorak. He picked up his phone. He'd had a text from Priya at the library. 2 days old. He'd read it and not responded the way he often did, not out of disinterest, but out of a habit of disappearance, a reflex of smallness. She'd sent, "Hey, did you end up watching the Scorsese one? I need to know if it's worth my evening." He typed, "Watched it twice. Worth 3 evenings. Also, you still have my stapler." He put the phone down, drank his tea. Outside, London was doing what London does on a Saturday afternoon in early June, absorbing its own event, settling back into the ordinary shape of itself. The buses running, and the pigeons conducting their permanent negotiations, and the plane trees shedding their pale skin in long curling strips that fall on shoulders and stay there, and sometimes nobody tells you. His phone lit up. "Priya, the stapler I completely forgot. Okay, watching it tonight. You're not wrong about 3 evenings, I can already tell." Then, 3 seconds later, "Also, you should have texted sooner. I've literally been watching mid-stuff for weeks." He looked at this for a long moment. Then, he looked at the anorak on the back of the chair. He thought, some things you just keep wearing. He thought, some things are too big for you, and you just let them go through. He thought, 53 people is a lot of people not to stop. 1 grandmother is not nothing. That night, he didn't watch a documentary. He sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper, an actual piece of paper which he almost never used for anything except book card inserts at the library, and he wrote down the 6-week count. All the numbers, all the locations. Not on a list, just scattered across the page the way they actually lived in him. The bus stop 61, the Tate Reading Room 14, the Embankment Sunday 38, the Crown Pub 45, the Warwick Way Sainsbury's 29, the Parade 53. He looked at them all. 240 scattered across 6 occasions. 240 people who had looked at or through or near Desmond Achike, and not stopped. He folded the paper once. Then again. Then he put it in the pocket of the burgundy anorak. He didn't know what he'd do with it. Maybe nothing. Maybe it would stay there until the anorak wore out, which at its current rate would be sometime around 2047. Maybe he'd find it one day and not remember what the numbers were for and throw it away. Maybe he'd find it and remember exactly. He went to the window. The street below was quiet in the way streets go, quiet past 11. Not empty, just particular. A fox crossing unhurried toward something it had decided on. A cab going somewhere. The orange of the street lamps on the wet pavement, because it had rained sometime in the last hour while he wasn't paying attention. He pressed 2 fingers against the glass. Not sadly, not dramatically, just touching a surface to confirm it was there. The glass was cold and solid and real. He was standing at it. That was enough of a number for one day.